G'day, mate. 40 here, and you have to be a hyper Donald Trump partisan to think that the Donald Trump who was presented to the jury in New York over the past few weeks is an admirable figure. I mean, the prosecution succeeded because they presented the most compelling story, and the defense was hamstrung considerably by political considerations. They didn't want to make Trump look weak. So when Trump denied the sexual affairs with Karen McDougal, Stormy Daniels, I think most people understand that he was lying. And Donald Trump, who was presented to the jury, was a sleazy liar. And so it's understandable why the jury voted to convict him. And it's not fully clear why the defense appeared just so inept at presenting a competing narrative. And then Donald Trump's reaction talk on Friday, I thought was really weak. I didn't feel anything when I was listening to it. I just felt like it was a waste of my time. He was consistently lying throughout the reaction speech. And Trump can leverage this conviction to his own advantage if he makes the case that his conviction represents something that's bad for the American people and he's fighting on behalf of the American people, and he keeps his focus on what this means for the American people. But he didn't seem to do that in his Friday talk. And that makes me think, when was the last time that Donald Trump gave a compelling speech? There was a terrific Politico article a few months ago that had one expert saying that Donald Trump was the funniest man in America. And I know he hasn't completely lost that, but has he somewhat lost that? I mean, where was the last time that Trump was consistently funny, consistently compelling? When did Trump last make a strong presentation of his own narrative? Because in a confusing, traumatic time, all right, the group, the entity that presents the most compelling narrative, meaning a narrative that makes the most sense of everything that's going on right now and presents the most compelling argument that we have the tactics for a way forward, all right, that group is more likely to win. So Trump's prosecutors won the trial because they had the more compelling narrative. One other quick thought that comes to me is that I noticed for people on the left, they had overwhelmingly a cathartic reaction to this Trump conviction. And so what is a catharsis? All right, I looked it up. It is the process of releasing and thereby providing relief from strong or repressed emotions. So after a release like that, I usually get sleepy. So I believe the left did experience a profound catharsis from the Trump conviction on Thursday. The right-wing reaction has been a furious release of energy. So the right is energized, and I get the sense that the left is somewhat sleepy in its reaction. And I don't see how that's good for the left. And why was the left so energized? Because they think that Trump has essentially been provided with immunity from the political process. And so they are looking to the legal process to get validation for their feelings, to get some relief from their feelings of outrage about Donald Trump. So if this conviction continues to provide the right with tremendous energy and the left with a sense of completion and satisfaction and release, I'd have to think that tactically that would work on behalf of the right. This is Michelle Goldberg. She is a left-wing New York Times columnist. She wrote 2 articles about me back in 1999. And back then, I think she was in her early to mid-20s. And she had the voice and manner of a 16-year-old girl. But now you hear her voice has matured considerably. Here she's making the point that the Donald Trump we saw in the political realm emerged largely unscathed, in her opinion. And that's why she is so rejoicing over the Trump conviction on that
this is going to finally put an end to Donald Trump or even change the trajectory of the election all that much. But I do think that if there had been a hung jury or an acquittal, it would have been really good for Trump, and it would have given him even more wind in his back going into the election. Whereas this is, I think, a reminder that Trump's aura of invincibility can be pierced, that, he loses in court again and again and again. The fact that our political system has proven so unequal to restraining his rampant criminality has, I think, given people a feeling of hopelessness. And I hope that this verdict punctures that a little bit because, when he's judged the way other people are judged again and again, juries, judges see through his misdoings.
It's so true. The institutions really have held up. David, why surprised?
Unsurprised.
Unsurprised. I apologize.
Yes.
Unsurprised. Well, we're really going to arm wrestle then.
Well, I'm not.
All right, that's David French. But I think Michelle Goldberg there gave the classic left wing reaction in that they think that Trump has gotten off scot free from the political realm. And so they want catharsis, right? Every side wants to feel good, but is your energy directed in a way that does good, right? So feeling good and doing good, there's no necessary connection. And I'm not sure that this Trump conviction is doing good for the left-wing case against Donald Trump.
She had an awful story to tell him at that time in the campaign when she came forward right after the Access Hollywood tape.
Yeah, so this is Hillary Clinton, who ran a pathetic campaign. Trump would have lost the 2016 election if he'd been facing Joe Biden.
Dropped and said, I've got a story to tell. It was critical for him to suppress as much as he could. So the prosecution had a very compelling story to tell, which was he was going to bury this, and he was going to spend a lot of money to bury it, and that he knew there was something about it that was wrong. That's why it was concealed. That's why the payments were mislabeled. And so nothing about the verdict actually surprises me.
To follow on to what David said, I mean, I was in the courtroom for a couple of days, including for closing arguments. And
Right, so that was David French, an anti-Trump Republican columnist for the New York Times. And back to Michelle Goldberg.
And what struck me is that the discourse around the case has been sort of meta. Should Alvin Bragg have brought it? What will a conviction mean to the election? But in the courtroom, it was, did Donald Trump do these things that he's accused of? And it was so obvious that he did. And even though lawyers I spoke to thought that Donald Trump's defense attorney did okay with what he had, from where I sit, his arguments just seemed so ludicrous. I guess he can't argue in court, right, that Donald Trump is being unfairly persecuted for something that other people get away with. So instead, he's arguing that Donald Trump never had sex with that woman, right, kind of echoing Bill Clinton. And then he is arguing that the $420,000 that Michael Cohen was paid to reimburse him for paying off Stormy Daniels was a legitimate legal fee based on a handshake or verbal retainer agreement that they had for Cohen to act as his personal lawyer, right? It was preposterous. And then the other thing that they argued, which also I thought was ridiculous, was that David's talking about how important the Access Hollywood tape is in understanding the kind of chronology and motivations. One of the things that Donald Trump's defense attorney tried to argue was that the Access Hollywood tape actually didn't matter that much. That it was a bad day and there was going to be, a few days of aggravation, but that people were exaggerating and thinking that this was a major moment in the campaign, which is just, if you live through it, that's ridiculous.
Right, so this Trump trial with Stormy Daniels' testimony, it reiterates the narrative found in the Access Hollywood tape.
Ridiculous.
Yeah, I think, Michelle, the precise legal word for that argument is bonkers. It's just wild. We all remember it. This was the biggest story in America.
All right, this is Patrick Healy. He's a gay left-wing New York Times former political correspondent who's now on the editorial side.
And this was the first time that you began to see Republicans fleeing the campaign after the convention. After the Republicans consolidated at the convention, you began to see cracks in the facade after the Access Hollywood tape. That was a 9-alarm fire. That was an emergency for the campaign.
And yet he held it together. And that goes to why I felt surprised by this. And it touches on things that you two have both raised now. While our institutions have often held up with...
Well, I think our legal institutions.
Our legal institutions have held up. That's the thing. The ability of Donald Trump and his team to have a playbook for almost any situation where, at the end of the day, even if reputations are scarred and people are thrown under the bus, he is still able to evade accountability. I only really saw that in the 2020 election, ultimately at the ballot box. And I've just found myself thinking, and maybe it's a little jaded, but that you get 12 jurors, in a room hearing the...
When the left talks about Trump evading accountability, they mean that he wasn't punished as we saw fit, all right? He was held accountable and he was elected president of the United States. So is not the left-wing, reaction to Donald Trump and his conviction driven by a desire, driven by a righteous indignation to see Donald Trump punished for his crimes? And so all desires for punishment contain a considerable element of vengeance. There's no punishment of a serious nature that does not contain an element of vengeance. And so why would then Trump's response to lawfare and to the Democrats' attempts to punish him, why would that similarly not be driven by a desire to punish the left for their bad behavior? And why would that not contain a considerable element of vengeance? So you can carry out your desire for punishment and vengeance in an effective way or an ineffective way. And so I'm curious if the right has enough effectiveness and legal expertise to offer a reciprocal lawfare prosecution against Democrats. All right, there is a downside to the Republicans becoming the party of the low IQ. Right, Donald Trump is great at crafting a narrative for the 90 IQ American. The elite scorn him, right? The higher your verbal IQ, the more likely you are to loathe Donald Trump. I suspect that Americans with an IQ over 130. A verbal IQ over 130 probably opposed Donald Trump by about 10-1. And Republicans have consistently, gone down market and appealed to a lower and lower IQ crowd. And so when Republicans wanted to fight all this same-sex marriage legislation and laws, all right, they weren't able to recruit elite law firms because no elite law firm would take on the case against same-sex marriage. And so I'm just curious, is there enough effectiveness on the right to practice a reciprocal type of lawfare, right? This is the downside to becoming the low IQ party, is that the elites and the smartest people will steadily desert you. And so the elites are arrayed against Donald Trump probably by a ratio of 4-1, 5-1. And if that ratio gets much higher, then Donald Trump's just not going to be able to accomplish anything. If you can keep at least 20% of the elite on your side, and so Trump is developing increasing support from Silicon Valley elites and by pro-Israel elites. But if the elite ratio, right, tilts even further against him, it's very hard to get anything done. And for the Republicans to reciprocate this Democratic Party-driven lawfare against Donald Trump, right, they need expertise and they need the elites. And I'm curious, do they have a sufficient amount of expertise and elites on their side to reciprocate, right? The Democrats were very effective, right? They were legally effective. They were legally efficient, right? They were legally able to accomplish what they wanted to accomplish. Now, they may well be politically incompetent, right? The political reaction to this legal conviction may provide far more damage to the Democratic Party's chances than if they'd never sought this prosecution in the first place. And so there are all these articles in the mainstream media right now about how, Alvin Bragg's decision to prosecute Donald Trump was vindicated. But I think that's way too early to say. If this decision is overturned in a stinging manner and the prosecution voided, right, is Alvin Bragg then vindicated if higher courts find that the whole basis of this prosecution was ludicrous, right? The appeals, I suspect, will focus on the weakest parts of the prosecution's case, and that's the legal theory, the completely unprecedented legal theory that was used to convict Donald Trump. We've never seen a conviction like it. I can't think of any other first world nation that would give Donald Trump the equivalent of a felony for this matter. Like, what other first world nation would convict Donald Trump of such serious crimes for what seems to be an elementary, paperwork mistake, right? This wouldn't happen in England or Australia. I'm just trying to think, what first world nations would punish Donald Trump like this? So people over the seas, when they try to follow this court case in Manhattan, it just didn't make any sense to them because they had no precedent in their legal system. So we had to completely change and innovate the legal system in the state of New York to enable this prosecution. And the innovative legal theory behind his prosecution is the weakest part of the prosecution's case and the most likely to be overturned by a higher court. And then will this democratic strategy of lawfare, particularly in the New York case, will that be vindicated when the case is overturned?
The evidence that there may be just one or two that sees a former president in the dock and wants such clear smoking gun level Law and Order drama that just really kind of nails him.
But they had it. They had smoking. I mean,
they didn't literally have Donald Trump saying a version of what he said in Georgia, which was, find me the, umpteen thousand votes that I need to get.
No, but they had tapes with him and Michael Cohen's, kind of talking about the payment to Stormy Daniels. I think that, a lot of people were worried, and I was worried that there was one juror that was sort of in the tank for Trump.